bullet, you pick that up.
Yes.
I have nothing further.
Cross-examine.
What's that? I would move them into evidence.
Is there objection?
No.
Numbers
146, 147, and 148.
are received.
Good morning, Officer Bray.
Good morning.
Did you collect any other guns or evidence, well, let me put it this way, any other guns than what you've just testified to?
No.
Are you familiar with AR-15s?
Yes.
How are you familiar with them?
I own them. I've shot them. I've trained with them.
Have you ever had an experience where one has jammed on you?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
You have to clear it, usually to rack the slide back to eject the jam, whatever the round is that's jammed in there. Send it forward, and another bullet would go into the chamber.
When you have to eject whatever's in the chamber, the thing that's being ejected, is that a spent shell casing, or is it
Could
an
be
unfired
either
round?
or. Could be either or.
We need to make sure we're not talking at the same time for the
Sure.
benefit of the court reporter. So, in your experience, have you ever had a situation in which you have pulled the trigger, the round has fired, but the spent shell casing did not automatically eject like it should?
Yes.
And then that process you've described would be the way of ejecting that spent shell casing?
Correct.
I have nothing further.
Does the court have a ruler? Sure, it's been previously marked as Exhibit 28. Not this specific gun, but are you familiar with guns like this type?
Yes.
And if one had a jam or had to clear, one would pull back. I don't know how to do it.
There you go. Yep.
Right here, correct?
Correct.
Show the trigger.
And that would eject the bullet that was here, correct?
Correct.
And I've got a standard ruler that I was provided by the court from the back of where the charger sits to the end of it, 4 inches. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And to clear the weapon, you have to take it all the way back and let it all the way forward.
Yes.
Which is a very obvious movement, correct?
Yep.
And takes time.
Yes.
Any cross?
Just one briefly. So, if you just fired that gun and that spent shell casing didn't properly eject, what would happen if you pulled the trigger then?
It
Again,
would go click. It wouldn't go bang.
so in order to fire the gun a second time after that, you would have to do that re-racking. Is
Yes.
that right?
Correct.
And then if there were ammunition in the magazine, it would load another round and the gun would be ready to fire.
Correct.
That's all I have.
Let me step down.
interview with Frank Hernandez.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony about to give in this matter be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
You may be seated.
Sir, will you state your name and spell your last name, please?
My name is Frank Andrew Hernandez, also known as Drew Hernandez publicly. My last name Hernandez.
Okay. And Mr. Hernandez, can you tell us a little bit of your background in terms of what you do for work?
So I'm a professional commentator on Real America's Voice. I commentate on the news, I commentate on what's in pop culture on a daily basis, and I also do on-the-ground reporting, specifically on protests and the 2020 riots.
And as it relates to the your on-the-ground kind of reporting is what I'm interested in. Were you in Kenosha on the evening of August 25th of 2020?
Yes.
And were you there to cover what was happening with the civil unrest in Kenosha?
Yes.
And were you able to do that with some type of video equipment?
I use my iPhone, and I also use a body cam. And specifically on this night, that's what I was using to document the riots.
Now, after the 25th, I don't want to know where you live, but you don't live in Kenosha. Is that
No.
fair?
No.
Was there a time after the 25th that someone from law enforcement had reached out to you to try to get a hold of some of the information that you had through video?
Yes, I don't remember his name specifically, but a detective did reach out to me.
Okay. If I said it was Detective Ben Antaramian or Detective Martin Howard, does that do anything
One
for
of the
you?
two. He identified himself from Kenosha.
And were you able to make connection in some form or fashion with those law enforcement officers?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just briefly explain kind of how that went down?
So they requested all the footage that I had, and they sent me a Dropbox link that was not sufficient. It only had, I don't know, not enough memory because the body cam footage is, over 50 videos. But the reason why I wasn't able to follow up was because I was covering all the riots last year. I was in Portland, Seattle, Washington, D.C., was all over the country, so I just lost track.
Okay, so is it fair to say after the civil unrest in Kenosha, your employment then took you to cover other things going on around the United States?
Yes.
And so, if I have it right, you and law enforcement had kind of not been able to connect for some period of time after that.
Yes.
Was there a period of time then closer to today, or this trial, that you were able to do that?
Yes, I did that through my attorney.
And were you able then to provide to both Mr. Rittenhouse's lawyers and the prosecution a full set of the videos that you had mentioned that you had taken?
Yes.
And so my questions to you initially will be this. Were you kind of working by yourself that evening, or were you working with a team, or what?
Yes, last year I was working independently by myself.
And is it fair to say that on that night you didn't know who Kyle Rittenhouse was?
No.
I don't know if you've heard this, but there's been other people mentioned, Mr. Rosenbaum. Were you aware of who that was?
No.
Were you aware of Mr. Huber or Mr. Grosskreutz?
No.
Okay, so you had no knowledge of any of these people prior to August 25th?
Nope.
Fair? Okay. So looking back now, understanding you're familiar with who Mr. Rittenhouse is now, correct?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to look back on your videos to see if you had captured Mr. Rittenhouse on video, had any type of contact with him in any way?
I have had no contact with Kyle Rittenhouse, but I have looked at footage to just go over it, yes.
And does your footage capture any, any contact, maybe not personal contact, but anything that you saw Mr. Rittenhouse doing that evening?
Yes.
Can you describe that?
So Antifa and the rioters were going head to head with the police in front of the courthouse. And as they were doing so, the police then responded. I believe they called an unlawful assembly of some sort because Antifa had their riot shields out. They were throwing rocks at the police officers. They were even trying to get inside of the hood of one of the police vehicles. And this is all documented on footage that I submitted as well. But to answer your question, when the rioters were being dispersed further down Sheridan towards the Car Source dealerships down the street, the rioters were grabbing concrete slabs. They were throwing them on the floor to create more rocks and to throw them at police officers. They were launching fireworks and other explosives that I couldn't identify. But as they were being pushed down the street, they